The fifth generation era refers to the computer and video games, video game consoles, and video game handhelds from approximately 1993 to 2001 for handhelds. This era was characterized by significant fragmentation, because the first handheld of the generation, the Sega Nomad, had a lifespan of just 2 years, and the Virtual Boy for less than 1 year only, with both of them being discontinued before the other handhelds made their debut. Nintendo's Game Boy Color was the winner in handhelds by a large margin. There were also 2 updated versions of the original Game Boy, Game Boy Light and Game Boy Pocket. The development of the Internet made it possible to store and download tape and ROM images of older games, eventually leading 7th generation consoles to make many older games available for purchase or download. Some features that distinguished 5th generation consoles from 4th generation consoles include 3D graphics, optical discs, game storage, CD quality audio recordings, early adoption of full motion video. History. Transition to 3D. The 32-bit/64-bit era is most noted for the rise of fully 3D games. While there were games prior that had used three-dimensional environments, such as Virtua Racing and Star Fox, it was in this era that many game designers began to move traditionally 2D and pseudo-3D genres into 3D on traditional gaming consoles. Early efforts from then industry leaders Nintendo and Sega saw the introduction of the Super FX and Sega 32X, which provided rudimentary 3D capabilities to the 16-bit SNES and Sega Genesis. Super Mario 64 on the N64, Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation, and Tomb Raider on the Saturn, are prime examples of this trend. Their 3D environments were widely marketed and they steered the industry's focus away from side-scrolling and rail-style titles, as well as opening doors to more complex games and genres. 3D became the main focus in this era, as well as a slow decline of cartridges in favor of CDs, due to the ability to produce games less expensively and the media's high storage capabilities. CD versus cartridge. After allowing Sony to develop a CD-based prototype console for them and a similar failed partnership with Philips, Nintendo decided to make the Nintendo 64 a cartridge-based system like its predecessors. Publicly, Nintendo defended this decision on the grounds that it would give games shorter load times than a compact disc. However, it also had the dubious benefit of allowing Nintendo to charge higher licensing fees, as cartridge production was considerably more expensive than CD production. Many third-party developers like EA Sports viewed this as an underhanded attempt to raise more money for Nintendo, and many of them became more reluctant to release games on the N64. Nintendo's decision to use a cartridge-based system sparked a small-scale war amongst gamers as to which was better. The media war was spurred on no less by statements from top company executives themselves. One Nintendo magazine ad placed a space shuttle next to a snail and dared consumers to decide which one was better. At the time, CD-ROMs did suffer from longer load times, although it was largely dependent on what device the user played the CD-ROMs on. Almost every other contemporary system used the new CD-ROM technology. Also appealing to publishers was the fact that CDs could be produced at significantly less expense and with more flexibility, and they were able to pass the lower costs on to consumers. In particular, the fifth generation marked a turning point for optical-based storage media. As games grew more complex in content, sound, and graphics, the CD proved more than capable of providing enough space for the extra data. The cartridge format, however, was pushed beyond the limits of his storage capacity. Consequently, many game developers shifted their support away from the Nintendo 64 to the PlayStation. One of the most influential game franchises to change consoles during this era was the Final Fantasy series, beginning with Final Fantasy VII, which was originally being developed for the N64 but due to storage capacity issues was shifted to and released on the PlayStation. Prior Final Fantasy games had all been published on Nintendo consoles Euro, either the Nintendo Entertainment System or Super Nintendo, with the only other entries being on computers like the MSX. Overview of the fifth-generation consoles. There was much confusion over which console was superior to the others. Adding to the uncertainty was the fact that there were more competing consoles in this era than at any other time since the North American video game crash of 1983, with video game magazines frequently performing side-by-side hardware specification comparisons of the systems using dubious statistics. Also, console makers routinely boasted theoretical maximum limits of each system's 3D polygon rendering without accounting for real-world in-game performance. The FM Towns Marty is sometimes claimed to be the world's first 32-bit console, being released in 1991 by Japanese electronic company Fujitsu. However, the Intel 80386SX CPU is not a fully 32-bit processor as it only supports 16-bit bus addressing. Furthermore, the 386SX supports a maximum of 24-bit RAM addressing. Never released outside of Japan, it was largely marketed as a console version of the FM Towns home computer, being compatible with games developed for the FM Towns. It failed to make an impact in the marketplace due to its expense relative to other consoles and inability to compete with home computers. Despite massive third-party support and an unprecedented amount of hype for a first-time entrant into the industry, the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer's $700 price tag hindered its success, selling 2 million units worldwide. The Amiga CD32 was sold in Europe, Australia and Canada, but never in the United States due to Commodore's bankruptcy. The Sega 32X, an add-on console for the Mega Drive Genesis and Sega CD, was launched a short time apart from the Sega Saturn. The Sega Neptune was also announced as a standalone version of the 32X CD, but ultimately cancelled. Sega failed to deliver a steady flow of games for the 32X platform. More importantly, with the Saturn and PlayStation already on the horizon, most gamers preferred to save up their money rather than spend it on a console that was doomed to become obsolete in just a few months. The Sega Saturn was released as Sega's entry into the 32-bit console market. It sold 9.5 million units worldwide. However, it was not the commercial success that the Master System and Mega Drive had been and lagged in third place. The Atari Jaguar was released in 1993 as the world's first 64-bit system. However, sales at launch were well below the incumbent fourth-generation consoles, and a small games library rooted in a shortage of third-party support made it impossible for the Jaguar to catch up, selling below 300,000 units. The system's 64-bit nature was also questioned by many. The 32-bit Atari Panther, set to be released in 1991, was cancelled due to unexpectedly rapid progress in developing the Jaguar. The Atari Jaguar CD, an add-on console for the Jaguar, was released in 1995. It was produced in limited quantities due to the low install base of the system. The PlayStation was the most successful console of this generation, with attention given by first and third-party developers enabling it to achieve market dominance, becoming the first home console to ship 100 million units worldwide. Because of many delays in the release of the Nintendo 64, in 1995 Nintendo released the Virtual Boy, a supposedly portable system capable of displaying true 3D graphics, albeit in monochromatic red and black. However, in practice it is not functionally portable, though it was at first marketed as such, and because of the nature of its graphical capabilities, the system can cause headaches and eye strain. It was discontinued within a year, with less than 25 games ever released for it. The Nintendo 64, originally announced as the Ultra 64, was released in 1996. The system's delays and use of the cartridge format while all of its competitors used CDs made it an unpopular platform among third-party developers. However, a number of wildly popular first-party titles allowed the Nintendo 64 to maintain strong sales in the United States, though it still remained a distant second to the PlayStation. NEC, creator of the Turbo Grey 16, Turbo Duo, Cora Grey, and Super Grey, also entered the market with the PCFX in 1994. The system had a 32-bit processor, 16-bit stereo sound, a 16,777,000 color palette and featured the highest quality full-motion video of any console on the market at the time. the PCFX broke away from traditional console design by being a tower system that allowed for numerous expansion points, including a connection for NEC's PC-9800 series of computers. Despite its impressive specs, it was marketed as the ultimate side-scrolling console and could not match the sales of the 3D systems currently on the market. They had also lost developer support by their past partners, including Hudson Soft, who contributed only one game. Results of the fifth generation. After the dust settled in the fifth-generation console wars, several companies saw their outlooks change drastically. Atari, which was not able to recover its losses, ended up being purchased by JT Storage and stopped making game hardware until the brand was revived for the Atari Flashback in 2004. Sega's loss of consumer confidence along with their financial difficulties set the company up for a similar fate in the next round of console wars. The Sega Saturn, although the most technically advanced console of the generation, ironically suffered from poor marketing and comparatively limited third-party support outside of Japan. Sega's decision to use dual processors was roundly criticized, as this made difficult to efficiently develop for the console. Regardless of their reasons for including it, only Sega's first-party developers were ever able to use the second CPU effectively. The Saturn was far more difficult than the PlayStation to program for. Sega was also hurt by a surprise 4-month early US launch of their console. Third-party developers, who had been planning for the originally scheduled launch, could not provide launch titles and were angered by the move. Retailers were caught unprepared, resulting in distribution problems. Some retailers, such as the now-defunct KB Toys, were so furious that they refused to stock the Saturn thereafter. Due to numerous delays, the Nintendo 64 was released 1 year later than its competitors. By the time it was finally launched in 1996, Sony had already established its dominance, the Sega Saturn was starting to struggle, and the Atari Jaguar and Panasonic 3DO were about to be discontinued and out of the competition due to financial losses. Its use of cartridge media rather than compact discs alienated some developers and publishers due to the space limits, the relatively high cost involved, and a considerably longer production time. In addition, the initially high suggested retail price of the console may have driven potential customers away, and some early adopters of the system who had paid the initial cost may have been angered by Nintendo's decision to reduce the cost of the system $50 6 months after its release. However, the Nintendo 64 was popular in North America, mostly the US, selling 20.63 million units in the region, and is home to highly successful games such as The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64, GoldenEye 007, Banjo-Kazooie, and Super Smash Bros. Still, while the Nintendo 64 sold far more units than the Sega Saturn, Atari Jaguar, and Panasonic Sanyo 3DO, it failed to surpass the PlayStation, which dominated the market. Later on, Nintendo released an add-on for their console. The add-on, titled Nintendo 64 Disk Drive, or simply 64DD, was announced in 1995, 4 years before the release. Nintendo was nearing the end of its lifespan at the release, so a limited number of games were released, about 9, and it was a failure, mainly for rarely appearing on store shelves. It was never released in America due to the failure, and has since become more of a collector's piece. Prices go extremely high on eBay, and other auction sites, so they are pretty hard to get a hold of. Home systems, comparison, other consoles, mass market. These consoles were created for the mass market, like the 5 consoles listed above. These, however, are less notable, never saw a worldwide release, and/or have sold particularly poorly, and are therefore listed as other. Non-mass market systems. Add-ons and remakes. Worldwide sales standings. From 1996 to 1999, Sony managed a 47% market share of the worldwide market, followed by Nintendo with 28%, while Sega was third with 23%. Production of the Sega Saturn was prematurely discontinued outside of Japan in 1999, with its demise being accelerated by rumors that work on its successor was underway, which hurt sales from late 1997 in Western markets. The N64 was succeeded by the GameCube in 2001, but continued its production until 2004. However, PlayStation production not ceased as it was redesigned as the FSON, further extending the life of the console around the release of the follow-up PlayStation 2. The PlayStation console production was discontinued in 2006, shortly after the Xbox 360 was released. Handheld systems. Software. Milestone titles: Castlevania, Symphony of the Night by Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo, and Konami is considered one of the best PlayStation games available, and a strong argument for the relevance of 2D games in an increasingly 3D market. Crash Bandicoot by Naughty Dog and Sony Computer Entertainment would go on to become Sony's unofficial mascot, in contrast with Nintendo's Mario and Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog. The game featured a marsupial bandicoot named Crash and would prove to be one of the PlayStation's most successful titles. Dragon Warrior 7 by Heartbeat, Art Piazza, and Enix was the #1 best-selling title on the PlayStation in Japan, released in 2000. The game was the first main installment of Japan's national RPG series released in 5 years. FIFA International Soccer by EA Sports and Electronic Arts has been described as one of the most influential sports games ever made. Final Fantasy VII by Square Product Development Division 1 and Squaresoft, is one of the PlayStation's most popular titles. It was the first game in the Final Fantasy series to make use of full-motion videos and opened the door to the mainstream US market for Japanese origin RPGs by Squaresoft. Final Fantasy became one of the biggest franchises in video gaming, with FFVII in particular having several spin-offs known as Compilation of Final Fantasy VII, including 2 sequels and a prequel. Gran Turismo by Polyphony Digital and SCE broke away from the mold of traditional arcade-style racing games by offering realistic physics and handling as well as a plethora of licensed vehicles. GoldenEye 007 by Rare Limited and Nintendo is a critically acclaimed game that helped make the first-person shooter a potential popular genre on consoles. Metal Gear Solid by Konami Computer Entertainment Japan and Konami received critical acclaim for its involved storyline, believable voice acting, and cinematic presentation, and is considered one of the best games of all time. The series remains a bestseller for the PlayStation, along with the series branching off to Xbox and other Nintendo consoles after many successes. The Need for Speed by Pioneer Productions and Electronic Arts shot well ahead of prior racing simulators in graphics and realism, and spawned a number of sequels. Nights into Dreams by Sonic Team and Sega was bundled with the Saturn's analog controller, which was almost essential to the gameplay. With its innovative gameplay and graphics, Nights, an exclusive title, aided in the selling of a number of Saturns. Panzer Dragoon Saga by Team Andromeda and Sega is the highest-rated Saturn title on game rankings with a score of 92.87%, and has been cited as one of the greatest games ever made. Parappa the Rapper by Nana on Sha and SCE, although only a modest success at its time of release, was highly influential in creating the music video game genre, which would grow in popularity throughout the 5th and 6th generations, thanks in large part to the popular Dance Dance Revolution. Perfect Dark by Rare Limited and Nintendo was critically acclaimed, building on what made GoldenEye 007 successful, making use of the Nintendo 64 expansion pack. It received a 97/100 from Metacritic and a 9.8 from IGN. The game was remade for its 10th anniversary in 2010 to positive reviews. Poker Copyright Mon Red and Blue by Game Freak for Nintendo, led to a massive success in both video game sales and licensed merchandise. In addition to establishing a wildly popular franchise, Poker Copyright Mon arguably helped extend the life of the handheld Game Boy system. Resident Evil by Capcom and Silent Hill by Konami Computer Entertainment Tokyo and Konami helped popularize the survival horror genre on consoles. This genre continued to grow in the 6th generation of video games, and Silent Hill and Resident Evil went on to produce many successful sequels. Both have since been adapted for films. Sega Rally Championship by Sega AM5 and Sega was the first rally racing game, broke new ground by incorporating different surfaces with different friction properties, and has been cited as one of the greatest racing games ever made. Super Mario 64 by Nintendo Entertainment Analysis and Development, and Nintendo left a lasting impression on 3D game design, particularly notable for its use of a dynamic camera system and the implementation of its 360-degree analog control. Super Mario 64 is one of the best-selling home console games of the era, selling 11.62 million copies worldwide. Super Smash Bros. Was a breakthrough IP for Nintendo, featuring characters from Nintendo-owned franchises fighting in a party-style game. It spawned 2 sequels, with 2 more sequels planned for the future. Spyro the Dragon by Insomniac Games and SCE was another defining title of the PlayStation. The game was released in 1998 to much critical acclaim, spawning a best-selling trilogy. Star Fox 64 by Nintendo EAD and Nintendo is the first Nintendo 64 game to use the Nintendo 64 Rumble Pack, which bundled with the game. It was a success and sold 3 million copies worldwide. Tekken 3 is considered not only to be the greatest installment of the Tekken series, but remains as one of the greatest fighting games of all time according to PlayStation Magazine. It has a Metacritic score of 96, and is the 12th highest-rated game ever according to Game Rankings. Its predecessor achieved similar feats until its succession, and the first game in the franchise was the first PlayStation game to sell over 1 million units. Tomb Raider by Core Design and Eidos Interactive popularized many elements seen in later video games and spawned several very successful sequels. The main character, Lara Croft, was named the most recognizable female video game character by Guinness World Records. 2 film adaptations have been released, the first of which, titled Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, is the highest-grossing video game to film adaptation as of 2014. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 by Neversoft and Activision garnered widespread critical acclaim and has been cited as one of the greatest games ever made. Virtua Cop by Sega AM2 and Sega introduced the use of 3D polygons to the light gun shooter genre, paving the way for future light gun shooters like Namco's Time Crisis and Sega's The House of the Dead, and was a major influence on GoldenEye 007. Virtua Fighter by Sega AM2 and Sega created the 3D fighting game genre. The console port, which was nearly identical to the arcade game, sold at a nearly 1-to-1 ratio with the Saturn hardware at launch. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time by Nintendo EAD and Nintendo is one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time and often listed as the greatest video game of all time. It transferred the playing mechanics of the previous 2D Zelda adventures to a 3D environment, with a third-person perspective that could switch to first-person view. It also featured mini-games, such as fishing and horseback riding, and gave birth to the Z-targeting system, which would become a mainstay in the series' battles. See also, Commodore International, The 3DO Company, Playdia, References.